Like Jay Bolter, his background is in far more classics than digital media. And he has found a way into the game studies where he's now. And he's going to talk about the player artist too, which hopefully continues the kind of thought that we had so far, that it more turns from the artifact, or at least the discussion about the artifact and the person who uses the artifact in the activity of play. So please welcome with me Henry Lowood from Stanford.
Okay, so I feel like a little bit of an outlier, I suppose, because my talk is about the player as an artist. If players can be artists, and if gameplay can be art, this conference is an opportunity to open up questions of performance and spectatorship, which is something I don't think we've talked about yet, that have largely been overlooked in most discussions of games as an art form. One way to attack these questions would be to look at traditionally artistic forms of performance in which players already are accepted as artists. I'm thinking of something like music or theater, but that's really not for me. I've been playing games all my life, and a lot of that has been sports activity, and so I'm going to take my analogies about the player as artists from sports, and I think actually this is very useful. Athletics and sports, while like games generally not considered in the realm of fine art, clearly evoke experiences that we easily describe as artistic or aesthetic. Now, much ink has been spilled on the question of whether games, especially digital games, represent an emerging art form. To be brutally honest, the part of this debate that's mired in defining terms such as game and art strikes me as really unproductive, and I'm really sorry about that if that's something you're interested in. These matters distract us from the lead story, at least I think it's the lead story, the technologies and practices emerging out of digital games that provide for cultural, artistic, and social expression. So fewer definitions, more stories, please. Most writing on games is art. Most of the presentations of game-based art and exhibitions, and probably most of the papers at this conference, look at game-based art as game design, and at game artists as auteurs. For example, the second point in Tale of Tales' real-time art manifesto is be an author. I'll kind of go like this every time I'm quoting something. It's be an author. This manifesto insists that in a medium for artistic expression, the artist must not hide behind the freedom of the user in an interactive environment, and real-time artistic work needs to come from a singular vision. Authorship, vision, and art, as engaged in this manifesto from Tale of Tales, and I think in most discussion of art games, is about crafting stories or creating experiences rather than using games as a performance platform. It's not just the game art discussion, by the way. Most game research depicts the game designer as auteur and as the primary creative impulse behind games and digital games. Well, before there's any trouble here, before anybody starts throwing things at me, let me disclaim any vendetta against game design or designers. I love them. It's only that for me, the creativity of players just happens to be as interesting. Game studies have not told us enough about players as performers, so I'm pushing for more attention to this topic. Sure, we know a lot about the participatory culture of digital games, but we don't give enough attention to performance. This is not an unusual situation in the digital arts at all. More than a decade ago, Randall Packer talked about user-driven interactive narrative in a comment about the net art of Jody, we've talked about a lot today, in Grammatron. He said, "The letting go of authorial control has been the big dilemma of interactive works as an art and/or entertainment medium." But then he added, games being the exception. And speaking of games, Roger Ebert famously argued that they would never move beyond craftsmanship to the stature of art. And why is that? Because video games, by their nature, require player choices, which is the opposite of the strategy of serious film and literature, which require authorial control. So the common thread here is this idea that artists letting go of authorial control when they use games is some kind of problem. I want to distinguish on this point between, say, modding or even gameplay as some kind of co-creation of the player and designer versus gameplay per se as a creative medium. That said, or it's a form of creative expression. That said, a performance culture built around play has indeed emerged from digital games. I'm proposing to consider this performance culture, by analogy to spectator sports, not so much in terms of cyber athleticism or esports, but as a basis for claiming that players are artists too. So, indulge me with a quick analogy from the sports world. Consider basketball. Who was more creative? Choice number one, James Naismith, the designer of the game and creator of its source code, the original 13 rules of basketball issued in 1891, you see on the left. Choice number two, Michael Jordan, player, right? Okay. I would offer to show you an example of one of his dunks, but it's been many years since I was 6'7", and I can't do it anymore. Okay, sorry about that. I really had some nice dunks there for you. Anyway, instead, listen to what a reviewer says about a commercial video on Jordan's early career. I'm quoting here. Footage of the slam dunk contest alone, which you just saw, right? Where Jordan captured his own goal of taking off at the free throw line and dunking at the hoop, complete with legs bent back in air flight, will leave viewers grinning and shaking their heads. His energy is endless, his creativity self-renewing, and his athleticism graceful and magical. This is the player pursuing his own goals to create a moment of graceful performance. In his rumination on the nature of athletic beauty, Sepp Gumbrecht considers our fascinations with athletic performances as aesthetic experiences. Under the rubric of form, he writes about the tension between the rules personified by the judge in sports such as gymnastics or figure skating, and the creative impulses of the athlete. He says that a reason for our discontent with judges is that they interfere with the ability of great athletes to let new and interesting things happen in their sport. Achieving the impossible, letting loose, being in the zone, these phrases capture our desire as spectators to see athletic performances that are unencumbered by restrictions and controls. We're compelled to watch by the prospect of capturing that liberating moment as an aesthetic experience. That's what I would argue. Gumbrecht tells us a bit more about this moment in the context of another fascination we have with the play. Form and image are paramount, first in what he calls the epiphany of form. He means that a beautiful play is produced by the sudden, surprising convergence of several athletes' bodies in time and space. Of course, this is also true in other performance disciplines, such as dance. In any case, these moments are unexpected. They're delightful surprises that happen suddenly in a moment of convergence between effort and resistance. I would say competition is a condition for this kind of convergence. Gumbrecht adds that wonderful play also takes on what he calls a temporalized form. This means that as soon as a play unfolds, it has begun to disappear. You know, pretty standard stuff for performance. It's begun to disappear, only then to be reconfigured in memory, imagination, and retelling. Quoting him, "Depending on whether my team or the opposing team produces it, I will be profoundly happy or profoundly sad by the time it vanishes. But looking back later, after hours, days, or years, I often realize that a beautiful play produced even by the opposing team has turned into a happy memory." Okay, in such game or sports performance, does the player usurp control from the game's creators, referees, and judges, let's say game designers in the case of digital games? Well, moments of exquisite performance are unpredictable and surprising, even to the player in many cases. When we acknowledge that the player is an artist too, it's not so much a matter of who controls the game. We do not have to decide between Naismith and Jordan, or between designers and players. They all can be artists. Perhaps one of the most remarkable things about designers, now, just to make you like me again, is that they're able to design games with the right balance of constraint and freedom. Players respond by figuring out how to perform in surprising and delightful ways. Like Michael Jordan painting on James Naismith's canvas, players are the experts on using games as performance spaces, creating and showing off their own moves and plays. Don't misunderstand me here as setting auteur against enactor. My point is just Michael Jordan is an auteur too. Do digital games produce players who can stake this claim? And that's a lot of what I'll be talking about now. So what kind of player accepts the challenge of using games or digital games as a performance platform? Why are some players extroverted while others prefer to watch? Players who create and circulate their performance rework diverse practices learned from hackers, fans, athletes, actors, and others. They become what I've called community players. A community player is a player who plays for other players. Because with digital games, most spectators are in fact players, and I'm going to return to that point later. It's important to recognize that digital games support extroverted and expressive play performance. My specific criterion for such performance is that it occurs when play is watched, interpreted, and analyzed and appreciated. So this performer-spectator relationship is very important. A relationship between player and spectator is at the heart of game-based performance. This is why game-based performance is closely tied to competitive multiplayer games, which we haven't really talked about very much today. Sports, of course, are competitive multiplayer games. The agonistic nature of sports helps us, by analogy, to think about digital gameplay as an art form. Generally speaking, writing on the aesthetics of sports tends to separate two kinds of performance. An example is David Best's important essay, The Aesthetic in Sport, first published in 1974. Best identified a conceptual gap between purposive and aesthetic sports. Most sports and games are purposive. An objective, scoring a basket in basketball, is achieved independently of the manner of achieving it as long as it conforms to the limits set by the rules or the norms. In other words, style points don't count towards winning in this kind of game. Even if aspects of them are artistic or beautiful, perceived as such, these aspects are irrelevant in the context of competition. As you've probably already guessed, in aesthetic sports, as in the arts generally, the goals and the manner of achieving these goals cannot be considered separately. Ice hockey is a purposive sport. Figure skating is an aesthetic sport. Michael Jordan's leap may be a thing of beauty. Well, it is a thing of beauty. But if the ball does not end up in the hoop, it's a thing apart from success in the game. Without knowledge of the rules, my appreciation of his form does not tell me if he's winning the game. Example, the manner in which Carrie Strug accomplished her vault in the 1996 Olympics did matter. And I can add to that, as the father of a competitive gymnast, I can usually tell when my son shows good form, but I'm horrible at guessing his event score. And the reason is that my knowledge of the complex rules of judging the competition is weak. In the conversation about sports as an art form, Best, the philosopher Best, and others distinguish the aesthetic from the artistic, and we've talked about that a little bit today. Roughly speaking, an aesthetic experience derives from a perception of beauty or grace. The artistic allows for the possibility of a close involvement with life situations. For example, the arts characteristically concern themselves with contemporary moral, social, political, and emotional themes. So we've had this distinction in different ways already today. Best argued that sports provide aesthetic but not artistic experiences. Quoting him, "Superb aesthetically at their best, these sports undoubtedly are, but they are not, in my view, art." Well, I disagree with his conclusion, but the important point is that in embodied sports, form and movement are usually seen as the basis for an accessible aesthetic experience. Digital games are not the same thing as physical sports, we know that, either in terms of performance or spectatorship. So in the time remaining, I'm going to explore their similarities and differences in two kinds of play considered as art, which I'm going to call impressive play and beautiful play. This leaves out a third kind of player performance, particularly in digital games, which I would call expressive play, which would be a whole different topic. Could be a book and so on and so forth. It has been several books. Expressive play, I'll talk about a little bit now and then I'll move on. Expressive play is a mode of player performance that's easily related to generally recognized forms of game art. I'm using there the definition that Matteo Bettante's given us of any art in which digital games played a significant role in the creation, production, and/or display of the artwork. So expressive play is about or located in the metagame. It matches up well with Best's criterion of close involvement with life situations for art. Expressive play is often outside or subversive of game forms, sometimes even antagonistic to the agonistic. I just had to get that phrase in. We've seen a whole bunch of examples of this sort of thing today. It often takes forms that are more linear than interactive. One of the criticisms of game art that we hear occasionally, casting the player in an authorial role. This is the case, for example, with machinima as game-based movie making. For all these reasons, expressive gameplay is more easily accepted as art than the other forms I will be discussing today. Indeed, its creators are often artists qua players, like Brody Condon, Corey Archangel, Mark Kornblatt, Jim Monroe, Anne-Marie Schleiner, several people who've been mentioned today. Same goes for machinima makers, many of whom have been trained in film, television, or improvisational comedy, like June Falkenstein or the Ill Clan. So I'm leaving expressive play out of my remarks about the player as artist because as the X in expressive kind of hints at us, it takes us outside play per se. Art as expressive play is based on gameplay, but it does not require spectators to appreciate play itself in aesthetic or artistic terms. And finally, we're going to hear from a lot of game artists at this conference, and the last thing you need is for me to talk about that kind of expressive play and that use of digital games as an expressive medium. So I'm going to pass on that. So let's move on. Whoops. That's another form of expressive play that I left out there, protest, involvement with real-world situations, both in sports and in digital play. So let me move on now to impressive play. Play, which I'm defining as play that fascinates and leaves a mark on the spectator. Impressive play is at the heart of the culture of digital game, performance, and spectatorship. The same is true, of course, in sports. Wins and losses are important, but player performance becomes transcendent when it makes an impression on us. Gumbrecht asks, what is it that fascinates sports spectators beyond victories, defeats, and broken records? Well, the role played by the spectator is crucial here. The phenomena of athletic performance are body movements shaped by the expectations and appreciations that spectators bring with them to the game. Whether in sports or digital games, movements and plays are complex and difficult to break down. Every spectator's experience is different and personal. The impression is created by the player, but depends equally on the knowledge, perception, and engagement of the viewer. So, many of you have read, how many of you have read, not that I can see you, but many of you have read Dave Hickey's The Heresy of Zone Defense. Could you just raise your hand if you've read it? Ooh, not that many. Okay, great, because I'm going to tell you what it says. Hickey's The Heresy of Zone Defense is an inspired essay on a key aspect of impressive play. Hickey is an art critic on the faculty at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Impressive play is the creative tension between the improvisational art of the player and the constraints of game rules. So let me summarize for those of you who haven't read it. Hickey starts with one of the legendary plays in basketball history. During the 1980, and I've just taken a few of the photographs that kind of go in a sequence there. You can probably follow it. During the 1980 NBA Finals against the Lakers, Julius Erving, Dr. J, so it's another academic, drove the baseline and soared towards the basket, only to have his direct path blocked by all 7 feet 2 inches of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He's going towards the basket, he can't get there. I'll let Hickey take over here. He looks like he's flying out of bounds, but no, somehow Erving turns his body in the air, reaches back under the backboard, with his long arms, reaches back under the backboard from behind and lays the ball into the basket from the left side. He comes completely around the backboard. As he watched this play, Hickey screamed and leaped in the air, taken by the moment, then watched the replay, quoting him again, "Jesus, what an amazing play. Just the celestial athleticism of it is stunning. But the tenacity and purposefulness of it, the fluid stream of instantaneous micro-decisions that go into Erving's completing it, well, it just breaks your heart. It's everything you want to do by way of finishing under pressure, beyond the point of no return, faced with adversity, and I'm still amazed when I think of it. So as he reflects on this, both as epiphany and I think as temporalized form, as Gumbrecht would put it, Hickey reflects on basketball as art, largely, I would say, in terms of its close involvement with life situations, as Best would put it. The adaptability, the creativity, the improvisation and fluidity of Dr. J's play shows basketball's emergence for Hickey from Dr. Naismith's game as an activity for pedagogical control, which it was when it was invented, to a form of public spectacle. This impressive play is a triumph of player performance over the constraints of rules, coaches, and systems. Hickey concludes that in the complexity of the game, there is the promise of solutions as daring as Dr. J's, and that's the message. Can players of digital games produce impressive play that resonates as deeply as Dr. J's move? Well, I'll answer this question with my own example. Blizzard's real-time strategy, I'll refer to it as RTS game, excuse me if you're not into the lingo. Blizzard's real-time strategy game, Warcraft 3, is one of a few dozen games that have created a basis for high-level, even professional esports, especially in Korea and Europe. It's a competitive game with an enthusiastic player community. In 2003, it became one of the games chosen for the annual World Cyber Games, becoming in effect an Olympic sport of digital games. In October 2004, San Francisco hosted the 4th annual WCG, which is the World Cyber Games, and I was there as head referee of the Warcraft 3 tournament, which that's a photograph of, and it's my knee on the right of the photograph there behind Grubby. After 3 days of, as this like knees on snakes, right? After 3 days of competition, a best-of-3 championship round matched two of the best Warcraft players in the world. The favored player, Welcome To, he's also known as Zakhard. His real name is Hwang Tae-min. Welcome To was from Korea, a Warcraft hotbed with professional leagues, star players, and television coverage. His opponent, 4K Grubby, who's named Manuel Schenkhuizen, came from the Netherlands and was the underdog. The crucial match, the second of 3 head-to-head games, came down to an impressive play that I think shared some qualities with Dr. J's behind the backboard move. And I think it'll be interesting. I'll explain the play to you, and it'll be interesting to go back and compare them. So let me set the scene. The match was played before a live crowd. You don't see it there. They were kind of up in the seats. We're on the floor right in that photograph. The match was played before perhaps 200 spectators in the Warcraft 3 area in San Francisco's Bill Graham Civic Auditorium. Others watched the match on screens around the facility. You could watch it if you were somewhere else in the auditorium or at the Half-Life tournament or something like that. Online, a larger Warcraft community simultaneously viewed a webcast with magnificent shoutcast commentary. I could sort of hear the echoes of it. It was unbelievable. Many more spectators have since downloaded the replay of this game. During the match, the in-house spectators gazed at a neutral observer view of the game map, identical to the webcast and piped to a very large overhead screen, kind of like this one. Although they could, the spectators in the facility could watch the players. They could stare at the players. They could look at their keyboards, marvel at the mastery of their hands furiously clicking away at keyboard and mouse. Or if their eyes were young enough and they had a good viewing angle, they could even follow the action on one of the players' own screens, seeing what they saw. But in fact, most live spectators kept their eyes glued to the large video display. They watched the avatars. In Dr. J's day, sports spectators mostly watched players without such distractions. This is not so true today, of course. Fans and even players report not being able to take their eyes off the $40 million, 48-foot video screens in the new Dallas Cowboys Stadium, for example. So we have that distraction now in real sports as well. Anyway, spectators whose eyes were focused on that big screen at the WCG saw roughly the same images of the game, unlike basketball fans in seats scattered around a basketball court, who of course all have different angles of the experience and see different things in a sense. So what did the Warcraft spectators see? The set of 3 matches revolved around a few pivotal seconds in the second match. As usual for both players, they each commanded orc armies. By the way, I know that some of this I'm saying to you is absolutely gibberish, and that's going to eventually be part of the point. Okay, so anyway, bear with me. The set of 3 matches revolved around a few pivotal seconds in the second match. As usual for both players, they each commanded orc armies. It was a mirror game. One of 4 types of teams of combatants available to them. About 6.5 minutes into the game, spectators observed the following. The armies were skirmishing around Grubby's main base. He's returning to base now, I think, in the video. After some back and forth, Welcome To's army fell back. His main hero, called the Farseer, was badly wounded, so Welcome To used what's called a town portal scroll to teleport his army back to their home base and heal up his forces. Very quick decision to do that. He, as far as people could tell, he succeeded brilliantly. They returned to base, but a few seconds after they landed there, this Farseer he was trying to save toppled over dead. Welcome To was unable to recover from this loss, and a few minutes later, he conceded the game. So, I'm going to compare, he's about to portal in a second, and you'll watch him when he goes to these buildings. That guy there on that animal, riding the animal, is going to just topple over. Then that's basically, everyone looks at that and says, uh-oh. Okay, I'm going to compare this moment of impressive and unexpected play, which probably very few of you here recognize as such, to Dr. J's feat of athletic art in a moment. But first, let me go back to the spectators. Despite, oops, there they go, he's landing, and you'll see him keel over in a second. Despite an outburst of loud cheers and even Dutch football club songs from the audience when the Farseer died, enough to briefly distract Welcome To, which very rarely happens in these games, only a few expert players and referees immediately grasped what had just happened. Most fans needed to look back carefully at replays in order to translate the events I'm about to translate for you, which transpired in perhaps 10 seconds, and to translate them into player actions. So here now is how a relatively knowledgeable fan of the game might put it, and this is going to sound even more like gibberish. Grubby's own Farseer hero had earlier in the game taken a wand of lightning from a Knoll assassin while creeping. It sat in his inventory. This item, when activated, casts a spell on a friendly unit. This spell provides protection by hurting enemies that come near to it. When Welcome To's Farseer activated his portal screen to return to base, it became invulnerable. Of course, right? Grubby could not hurt it directly, but instead, he instantly clicked on the wand, or he hit a key selecting it. He moused his cursor over Welcome To's second hero, a Fire Lord, and then clicked the mouse to cast the lightning shield on Welcome To's Fire Lord. This shield would now do damage over time to any of Welcome To's forces standing next to the Fire Lord. Well, Grubby knew instinctively, like in this 1 second of decision making, he knew instinctively that Welcome To's 2 heroes would land together and next to each other in the base, so that instead of finding safety, the wounded Farseer was destined to die simply by standing next to his charged teammate. So he turned this brilliant move of escape that Welcome To had made into a disaster by casting a spell on one of Welcome To's characters. Well, GG, good game, match over. Grubby, wow, great. I'm glad, it's a good audience. Grubby went on to win the Warcraft 3 championship 2-1, establishing his career, which continues today, although he's near retirement at the age of 23, as one of the most creative, competitive players in the world, the Michael Jordan of his game. Like Dr. J's airborne improvisation, Grubby's impressive play was instinctual, unexpected, novel, individual, and in some sense transgressive. It was not just amazing, well, I'll let you watch that. It was not just amazing and pretty much impossible for most players to reproduce, but by achieving it, Grubby expanded the possibility space of the game. Let's go to Dr. J for a second. Dr. J's moment had 2 interesting characteristics. First, it was triggered by resistance, Abdul-Jabbar's impenetrable defense. This is why competitive games are so important in this context. If the Lakers had played like my Golden State Warriors have this year, he would have had a clear path to the basket and could have just as easily dunked it with any effort. Okay, not as many people got that one. Anyway, second, the new and imaginative thing about his move was that he went outside the boundaries of the game by using the space behind the backboard, which players hadn't really, at least that we know of, hadn't really thought of using in that way before. And furthermore, he did it in an impossibly athletic way. Up until that time, nobody had put out of bounds in play so creatively, at least not in a memorable fashion. Well, Grubby's Warcraft 3 move, I would argue, shares these exact qualities. Instinctively, he reacted to his opponent's resistance, taking advantage of Welcome To's use of a skilled defensive maneuver. In fact, in the shoutcaster, what you hear is the shoutcaster saying, "Great save by Welcome To." He's gotten out. Grubby leverages his opponent's skill to prod his own improvisation. And like Dr. J's reversal of the dead zone behind the basket into an area of lively innovation, on the fly, Grubby turns a defensive spell designed to protect his own players inside out by using it to attack his opponent. And this is all improvised within a second, knowing what key to click, knowing who to cast it on, and all of that. A move, incidentally, by this move of putting the lightning shield on an opponent's unit is known by every Warcraft 3 player today, and most know it as one that Grubby came up with. One last point about impressive play, whether in basketball or a digital game. While, as Vince Lombardi famously said, winning may be the only thing, it is not necessarily the impressive thing. In fact, games that encourage perfect play, min-maxing as some gamers might say, kind of abolish impressive play. Creativity and improvisation disappear, and performance stops mattering. In digital games, this is the zone of the perfect build or the optimal strategy, carefully calculated in obsessive practice and unleashed in a manner that makes resistance futile. Interestingly, Gumbrecht identifies the exact same problem in athletic games, in which physical abilities seem in some sports to be reaching optimal levels. He asks, if contrary to the opinions of most coaches and specialists, I am right in saying that scoring and winning are not what exclusively fascinates fans, could it be that some ball games during the past decades have crossed a dangerous line of optimization where efficiency begins to turn against aesthetic enjoyment? So I just throw that out there as something to chew on. Because now I want to turn to the last kind of play I want to talk about today, which is beautiful play. My sense of game culture is that considering expressive play and impressive gameplay, at least maybe after you've listened to me talk about it for a little bit, as art forms, is not particularly controversial. The last part of my talk here is a little bit more speculative, and some of you are surely going to think of it as quirky and maybe a little odd, and it won't end with any sort of satisfactory conclusion. I'll end all the suspense now and reveal what my question is. We know that we have beautiful games, but are players playing games beautifully? Well, a beautiful play is impressive, of course, but it's also more than that. And of course, artistic play does not have to be beautiful. It can be expressive or impressive without being perceived in aesthetic terms. So what then is beautiful play? I imagine play as both graceful, defined famously by Schiller as beauty in motion, and as an act of grace, meaning as a gift from the player to the spectator. Again, analogies to sports help here. Robert Reinhardt has written that contemporary sport is a performance, not unlike the performances that artists of any kind use to demonstrate their art, their selves, their souls. It's a kind of cultural performance. When we think about a sport like football, meaning soccer, the Brazilian variety especially, as the beautiful game, Pelé is of course the player most frequently associated with this concept, into which we mix several elements of his play and personality. His beautiful play was stylish and acrobatic, brilliant and creative. At the same time, he displayed his enthusiasm for the sport and indeed for life through his play, an aspect of his game that he emphasized by calling his autobiography My Life and the Beautiful Game. The beauty of sports is even more complicated than the multiple elements of Pelé's beautiful game. In a short piece in which he called basketball the most balletic of games, the sports writer Frank DeFord noted that as lovely as those great players, he meant LeBron James and Kobe Bryant, as lovely as those great players move on the court, though, basketball remains foremost an ensemble game, which is why teams that are unglamorous but more unselfish usually win in the end. Teamwork is still the real beauty of the sport. So that's something a little bit different from grace. Determining wherein lies the beauty of gameplay is further explored in Pegg and Miles' Brand's, The Beauty of the Game, which appeared in the collection Basketball and Philosophy. I'm sure not all of you have read that. Miles Brand is probably best known for his frequent clashes with basketball coach Bobby Knight, while president of the University of Indiana, and he was later also president of the National Collegiate Athletic Association. The conceit of his essay is to set up a philosophical debate about beauty in basketball through a fictional argument between Dick Vitale and Billy Packer. How many people know who they are? Okay. These are sportscasters who are very well known for doing college basketball. Anyway, he sets up this story in which they interrupt their broadcast of the finals of the NCAA championship game to get into a discussion, so much so that it distracts them from continuing the broadcast. Vitale extols a successful shot as beautiful. Beautiful shot, baby. And Packer challenges him, arguing, why not just admit it was a successful shot, satisfactorily executed, and leave it at that? After a thorough, if colloquial argument that brings in the aesthetics of Plato and Hume, the broadcasting team agrees that basketball can be appreciated in two ways. First, subjectively, even casual spectators recognize beauty in the movements and visual spectacle of basketball as a kind of improvised and practiced dance, okay, in the forms, movements, physical beauty. But you don't have to be an expert to recognize that. Second, knowledgeable coaches, players, and fans perceive an inner beauty to the game, comprising the strategy and execution of plays and the goals they achieve. These are, in a sense, the Platonic forms of the game, and fans rely on acumen and insight to recognize what's going on in the players' heads, not just in their bodies. Okay, should be starting to sound a little more like Warcraft 3. Subjective external beauty in sports has been exhibited by, Jesse Owens or Pele or Muhammad Ali or Michael Jordan, names you all know. The inner beauty of the game is shown to us by players like Magic Johnson or Tim Duncan, whose nickname is the Big Fundamental in basketball, or maybe Derek Jeter in baseball. You might know their names, but I bet you'll find it kind of difficult to tell me exactly what's beautiful about them as players without delving into the finer points of their games. A spectator cannot discern Grubby's mastery of the syntax and tactics of Warcraft simply from staring at a screen. A replay movie cannot tell anyone what Grubby was thinking as he worked out his strategy. If he clicked on the wrong unit, if he had clicked on the wrong unit, or if he had randomly cast the spell, everything, if he'd randomly clicked in the right place, everything would look the same. In the Civic Auditorium or listening to the shoutcast, we might fill in a few blanks from the commentator noting, "The Farseer has fallen," and "Good work by Grubby," from the sudden applause and singing by the European fans in the audience, or from the pained expression on Zakard's face. A knowledgeable player tapped into Warcraft discussion forums and replay sites began to know what happened. Grubby had performed. He grasped an instant opportunity, made a preposterously rapid decision in the real-time heat of battle, applied masterful knowledge of game syntax and micro, which is the term players use for micromanagement of units, and he carried out this game-winning performance. His mastery, his tactics, and his strategy translated into a story about the match that can't be isolated at any of these levels. So it's very important that stories could then be told about the game that made this moment, this sort of temporal moment live on after the performance. There were many chronicles of Grubby's victory that explained what he had done, and these accounts fit the events into stories such as the amazing comeback, the startling defeat of the suddenly demoralized Korean favorite, payback for the arrogance and hubris of Welcome To's choice of this inferior Fire Lord as a hero. By the way, I can tell you as the head referee before the match, Welcome To, with the big Korean media coverage of this, was preening for the cameras and all this sort of thing that kind of adds to those stories. Or even a morality tale on the superiority of quick tactical thinking over high actions per minute counts, i.e. mind over body. This possibility of retelling the play reminds me of Michael Jordan rising from his sickbed to win the decisive game of the 1997 NBA championships, the famous flu game, and thereby personifying the modern athletic warrior. Or another one that just from the Bay Area I have to tell, Joe Montana beginning the winning drive of the 1989 Super Bowl by walking into the huddle on the 8-yard line or something like that, winking and asking one of the players about somebody in the audience, isn't that John Candy? And that story has been used to personify coolness under pressure. We want to tell stories about players who play beautifully. Okay, it seems to me that Grubby's moment of beautiful play in Warcraft 3 reveals a general point about digital games, and it also tells us something about its similarities and differences with the aesthetics of athletics. As we've seen, a beautiful play is both skin deep and below the surface, both external and internal. The former is accessible to any spectator, while the latter is locked away for the insider and the fan. Looking back at the games and game cultures we've had in the first nearly half-century of digital games, I have to confess it's very difficult for me to discern a degree of player control and freedom and individuality in control that allows for graceful play without bodies, for movements and forms that strike the eye immediately as creative and meaningful, and that do so in a way that's accessible to almost anyone. Beautiful play in digital games thus far, while indeed deeply meaningful and exciting to the spectators who grasp it, is largely on the inside. It's about discerning purpose and reason, as the brands wrote about basketball, and about being an insider. And the communities who appreciate this beautiful play are, in fact, all insiders and players. Okay. Whoops. I'm a glass half full. Let's see if I can run this while I'm finishing here with my conclusion. Well, for some reason it doesn't like video here. Anyway, I'm a glass half full, not a glass half empty kind of guy, and therefore I'm not troubled by the limitations on beautiful play in digital games. Insane play-based expressive performances like Dance Voldo Dance, which you're seeing right now, and Grubby's amazing, imagine you're seeing it right now, and Grubby's amazing competitive improvisations are both impressive and beautiful. I hope in the future that more people will be able to appreciate that, but that will require new modes of play. And I hope that game designers will keep making games through which players can be artists too. Thanks very much.